You'll be able to see those auto-generated captions. And now I'm going to turn things over to Mark. And Mark, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself as well, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure thing. Thanks, Becca. My name is Mark Buchanan, and I work with the Brownfields Assistance Center at Marshall University. I'm going to be kind of kicking things off. I'm going to run through some real quick introductions. And I've got a few slides that I'm going to share, and then I'm going to turn it over to George Carrico, and then from there we'll hear from Carrie and Aaron as well. So if you guys are ready to go, Carrie, do you have control of the slides, or Becca?
Carrie does.
All right.
I was making sure that you were seeing the right desktop, and Becca assures me that you are. So
Okay, we're good. Here we go. All right, we're going to start off with some introductions. Erin Britton is from the West Virginia DEP, and she is with she's a Brownfields Program Manager, and she runs the voluntary remediation program there at the DEP office. We're also going to be hearing from George Carrico. He's the director of the Brownfields Assistance Center at Marshall University. And then Carrie Staton is the Brownfield Assistance Center director at WVU. Oh, I forgot, we do have Bucky Brownfield. You will not be hearing from the rodent today, but he is here in spirit. So next slide. All right. So why apply for a Brownfields assistant grant? After all, the process it's a huge investment of time, resources, with zero guarantees. The simple truth is that brownfield remediation work can be very, very expensive. Simple assessments alone can cost tens of thousands of dollars, with cleanup expenses in orders of magnitude more. Next slide. All right, this graphic on this slide summarizes the brownfield process. Across the bottom, you have EPA funding sources, T for targeted brownfield assessment dollars, assessment grants represented with an A, cleanup grants represented with a C, the revolving loan fund, the R, and the M stands for multi-purpose grant. Community involvement, as you see on the left-hand side, is vital throughout the process from the beginning to the end. The graphic highlights each stage and phase of the process, as well as the funding sources that are permissible for that particular stage. You can see from the beginning, identify the site with reuse potential. You can use assessment dollars and multi-purpose grant funds for that. Phase 1 assessment, all appropriate inquiry. Again, assessment grant, multi-purpose grant, and a targeted brownfield assistance. The voluntary cleanup program, all four are eligible for those funds to be used for that phase. Moving into phase 2 assessments, you get assessment grant, multi-purpose, and targeted brownfield assessment funds as well. Site vision and reuse, again, assessment and multi-purpose grants are permissible here. The cleanup grant, all 5 sources are permissible here. Leveraging sources, you're on your own, I guess, but nonetheless, that's part of the activity. The cleanup, you have the multi-purpose grant is permissible here, as well as the cleanup grant, excuse me, and the revolving loan fund, ultimately leading to redevelopment of that parcel, making it a useful piece of property again. Yeah, next slide. This graphic shows the brownfield funding needs broken into 4 categories, excuse me, along with their associated activities. As you can see on the first, on the far left one, environmental assessments and land transfers, site planning and preparation, remediation, site engineering, infrastructure improvements. Site development is the next step, building, construction, or rehabilitation, business development, and you're going to be looking at financing for businesses occupying remediated sites. Now, all of these are the steps that are going to get you into the process of moving a piece, a brownfield property over into a useful parcel again. Next slide. The next slide actually shows what steps could be covered by the EPA funds. You can see under the site acquisition and due diligence, environmental assessments can be covered. That's your phase 1, phase 2 reports. And then over in that second block, site planning and preparation, site planning and feasibility studies, as well as the remediation or cleanup work. Next slide. So who is eligible to apply for a brownfield grant? We've got a list here: state and local tribal governments, general purpose units of local government, regional council or redevelopment agencies, nonprofits, quasi-governmental agencies. Next slide. I'm going to turn it over to George Carrico now, and he's going to start carrying a little bit deeper with some more information.
Okay, thanks, Mark, and welcome everybody. Great to have y'all out and spending a little bit of your day with us. I know everybody's busy, so we appreciate your time. So we're going to talk about the different types of grants that are available through the EPA Brownfields Program. Mark's already mentioned the multipurpose grants, assessment grants, revolving loan funds, and cleanup grants. Notice these were also known as MARC grants, but not Mark Buchanan. It's Mark with a C. So, but anyway, he's introduced us to these. Now we're going to get into each one of these in a little bit more detail. So if you go to the next slide, this just gives you an overview. We're going to get into each one of these in more detail. But again, these 4 different grant opportunities that are out there. Assessment grants, there are some different types, and we'll talk about that. The revolving loan fund, which is a big heavy lift, but we'll talk about that a little bit. Cleanup grants, that's what we all hope to get to, is to have that site ready to be cleaned up and then get it done and get it ready for the next step. And then the multi-purpose grants, that's a unique one for sure. It's actually a combination of assessment and cleanup grant activity work. Mark's already pointed out that community involvement and engagement is a huge part in all this, and we'll be continually reminding you about that as we move forward and talk about each one of these. So if we go ahead and go to the next slide there, the first one we'll talk about the multipurpose grants. And this is a very unique type of grant opportunity. This is, again, you're talking about combining assessment activities and cleanup activities. So you can do assessment work, those phase 1s and phase 2s, and cleanup planning related work. And you can also do actual site cleanup activity, remediation work. It's these are for those entities that you have a very discrete, very specific area that you want to be working in. That could be something as simple as it's a particular block of property or a couple blocks of property in a city. It could be a business corridor or a travel corridor within a particular area that you're going to be focusing on. So the bullet items there, I won't read those to you, but you can see each of them, some of the things that you can do with the money. Again, the assessing properties, cleanup of properties, and yes, there's a extensive community engagement activities that EPA wants to see within this particular grant, as with the other grants as well. It is worth noting here that these multi-purpose grants, the idea is you have to conduct at least one full environmental site assessment on a property with this funding, and you have to do at least one brownfield site cleanup of one of the properties within that particular area. And if you don't have an overall plan for revitalization of that particular target area that you're looking at, you need to also make sure that there's an overall plan that is included. You may have a concept plan, or you may have started on one. You can use this funding to help to move that plan forward and get it all finalized. Again, conducting the community engagement activities is a big piece of this one as well. And one more note about these. The applicant has to own at least one site, and it can be more than one site, but at least one site that meets the circular definition of a brownfield site. So you have to keep that in mind, and we'll talk a little bit more about that particular piece there a little bit later. So that's the multi-purpose grant. And we've already got somebody lined up, we think, that might be a really good candidate for one of those this next round. All right, assessment grants. These are the most common grants that communities and the eligible entities will go after. These are just what the grant says. It's to assess properties, and the primary use of the funding is to do those phase ones, the phase twos. You're finding out about the history of those properties. You're finding out about the contaminants that are on there. You're doing soil sampling, groundwater sampling of building materials, etc., to find out what those contaminants are. Okay. Now there's if you notice the third bullet item there, conduct community involvement and facilitate area-wide planning. Community involvement, big piece of this. You've got to have those community components involved. And also notice the second bullet item and the last bullet item. You can do site redevelopment planning, even both on an individual site, a site-by-site basis, and also an area-wide plan as well. So there's some latitude with what you can do with assessment grant funding. Look at the next slide. There's these are the types of assessment grants. The first one there, the community-wide, that's what most folks are going to go after. As an example, the city of Huntington was just awarded a new EPA Brownfields grant, and it is a community-wide one, so they can use that funding anywhere within their particular geographical area. And you, as the applicant, you define that area as to where you're going to be working. As another example, EPA region, West Virginia Region 2 Plan Development Council, they just received a new brownfield assessment grant. And that one actually covers their whole, I think it's a 6-county area that they cover. So again, you can use their funding primarily for doing assessment work, also all the community involvement that is required. And this is where you can do things like your inventory development and updating of your brownfield inventory, site redevelopment planning work, again, site by site, or also some community-wide aspects as well there. The coalition grant, the second one there, it's the same thing. It's an assessment grant, but you have at least 3 eligible entities that have all come together to work within a particular target area. You have one that is the lead agency. They're the lead entity. They're the ones that they get the grant. They manage the grant. They take care of the reporting and all the financial aspects. The other 2 act as support to the lead entity. And it is worth noting here that all the entities have to be eligible entities that for this particular grant. And EPA is really interested in seeing nonprofits and entities like that are coalition partners. Now, a nonprofit can't be the lead eligible entity, but they can be a supporting partner, and EPA really likes to see that. So the lead entity could be a town, a city, a county, a regional council, a general purpose unit of local government, et cetera, something like that. It's a great way to get a lot of partners involved. And again, you have an extensive community role as well. The third one there, the state and tribal available to states and so forth. Our state DEP, and Aaron leads that up. They have a current EPA Brownfields Assessment Grant. And I think, Aaron, I'm not sure, this is probably like number 5, I think, maybe for DEP. They've had great success with getting their assessment grants and utilizing them all across the state. And I do want to make one note. In years past, there has been what's called site-specific assessment grants. And that is, just as it sounds, you're getting funding just for one site, and you can only use that on one site. We generally discourage folks from doing that. That wasn't an eligible one from the last reporting cycle, or the last funding cycle. But if you're thinking about just one particular site, please call us and let's talk about it, because it might be a better way to approach that one. or maybe turn that into a more of a community-wide type of application or whatever the case might be. But if you have one site in particular that you're talking about, call us and let's talk about it. And let's see what we can come up with as a strategy to how to handle that particular site. All right, so that takes care of our assessment grants. If we go to the next slide, the revolving loan funds. These are not for the faint of heart, and we'll tell you that up front. It is a loan program, and it's to provide loans and to a lesser extent some sub grants, but primarily loans. So these are loans to be paid back, and it is for use on eligible brownfield properties to remediate those properties. So that's the activities that you can use that funding for. Couple things to note. Yes, there is a particular performance period on these. However, EPA, they expect to fund these to get you started. And then as you make loans and those loans are paid back, then you make new loans and they're paid back. And they actually hope that and there's also opportunity for some supplemental funding that you can get as well. But the idea is EPA hopes that these will turn into years of revolving loan funds. And actually across the country, there are some examples of some revolving loan funds that have been in place for over a decade now. So this does require long-term commitment by an entity that's going to take these on. The resources, the labor, et cetera. And EPA stresses this, and we will too. You've got to have a very strong understanding of things like real estate financing, loan underwriting, loan servicing, credit analysis. All those types of things also play a role in here. The good thing is we've got a few folks around the state that do have revolving loan funds. And if you were interested, we could definitely put you in touch with them. Aaron with DEP, they have got a revolving loan fund here in Huntington. They've got one. There's a few others around the state as well. And they'd be happy to share what I'll call the good, the bad, and the ugly with dealing with these revolving loan fund grants. Again, they're very serious. So the item there on the right, if you are considering applying for one of these, please contact us, and we'll get Aaron and DEP on the phone and other folks, and we'll talk about it and see if this might be right for you or not. All right, so on to the last type of grant within the EPA Brownfields programs. And this is what we all hope to get to where we can apply for these. You've done your assessment work. You know what contaminants are on a site. You know what it's going to cost to clean that site up to get it ready for reuse. So now you can apply for the funding to do just that. Cleanup grants do require a little bit of additional work, but it is providing the funding, including, as Mark mentioned earlier, if a site's going to go into the voluntary program here within the state, funding can be used to help to many of those factors there and the costs that are associated with that as well. Keep in mind, the applicant must be the owner of the property at the time you submit your application. It's not saying, well, we have a pile of dirt that's contaminated we're going to get rid of, and some drums out back we're going to get rid of. So give us $500,000 and we'll take care of it. You have to have very specific cost estimates. You've got to have your cleanup plans. There's a lot of extensive work involved with this that you have to kind of keep in mind. But again, you've got to be the owner of the property. On the next slide here, we talk about some extra steps that are involved in this whole process for cleanup. And this is just for the cleanup grants. Number one is you got to make sure that the property is eligible for funding. So how is the entity that's applying for the grants, how did they obtain that property? Did they do their due diligence? Have they done everything to where it is eligible for funding? If you're not sure, call us. We'll talk about it. We'll go through the steps on how you obtain the property and see if it will qualify or not. Also want to add a couple other things here. As we've talked before, the community involvement is a huge piece of all the EPA Brownfield program. This one even more so. prior to submitting your application, you've got to do a few extra things here. One is you've got to have a public meeting. You've got to advertise that public meeting, give folks the opportunity to attend, and there you talk about your plan to submit that cleanup grant, what it entails, what you plan to do with the cleanup grant funding. And then it allows the public an opportunity to comment, to ask questions, etc. Everything has to be documented, who attended, what questions were asked, how were they answered, things of that nature. There's also another step involved here too. It's called an ABCA that has to be available for review. And by the way, at that public meeting, you have to at least have a draft of your narrative of what you're going to be submitting so they can review it and ask questions about it. So you've got to do a lot of work long before the application is due. The ABCA, that is an analysis of brownfields cleanup alternatives, ABCA. That is a document that you have to have ready to go with your application. It provides all your site background, like summaries of the assessment work that's been done there. So you know about the site history, you know about the contaminants that are there, and the levels of remediation that need to occur in order for that property to be reused. It talks about your remediation plan, how you looked at different options, and how you basically have came up with the final option that you plan to use this funding for. So there's a lot of extra steps here that are involved within the cleanup grant process. Having all your cost estimates and all those various things together, it's a huge part of this. In future webinars, we'll get into much more detail about these, but if you've got a site that you're looking for a potential cleanup on, let us know. We're happy to help you with some of those extra steps that are involved there. All right, so those are the 4 different main categories of grant funding that's available out there. So we'll close up with these last 2 slides, and then I'll turn it over to Carrie. Just real quick, this is the authorized funding levels. So you can see for yourself there with these various grant types, there can be a lot of money there. Last year was the first year this occurred, but we've always had our regular appropriated funding. But last year there was some additional funding from the infrastructure bills that were passed. So we actually had, if you would, 2 different revenue streams or 2 different funding streams. So you can see quite a difference. Just look at the cleanup grant as an example. Normally they're up to 500,000. You can get up to 650,000 with a waiver, with a 20% cost share. With the infrastructure funding, it was actually up. It's actually authorized for up to 5 million and no cost share. So that's really intriguing and well worth taking a look at. So the next slide, the last one that I'll do here, this is what is anticipated for this next round of funding that'll be coming up later this year. This is based on last year, what happened and what we saw. So multi-purpose grants, that's great, up to 800,000. Again, assessment work and cleanup work on a particular targeted area. Your assessment grants, just for one entity, you can apply up to $500,000. If you do a coalition grant with at least 3 eligible entities together, and one is the lead, up to $1 million. RLF grants, we expect up to $1 million on those as well. And then the cleanup grants, this last round, there were 3 tiers. The vast majority of these will fall in the up to $500,000 category. EPA will fund some up to $1 million and even less, but a few up to the $2 million mark. That's what happened last time. That's what we anticipate this time, subject to change just any minute. But it does show you that there's a lot of potential here for some serious funding to help you in your particular community. So that gives you a broad overview of the different grants that are available. If you're not familiar with them, we'll be getting into much deeper dives later on in future webinars. And now with that, we got to turn it over to a very important section about how you apply and some details there. So I'll turn it over to Carrie. Carrie's the director of the Northern Brownfield Assistance Center at West Virginia University. Carrie, take it over.
So that as George said and sort of teased a little bit, and we'll hear more about later, this is meant to be your introduction to EPA grants and kind of whet your appetite for whether you might want to apply for one. But there are things that if you do decide you are considering applying for one, that you can go ahead and get started on and that we can start helping you with. And so in order to do that, you need to know sort of what does that application process look like. So this is just a little general roadmap of what it usually looks like. The process always looks pretty much exactly like this. The dates and sort of timeline are educated guesses based on what the timeline looks like in a typical year. So early in the year, we would suggest that you start to think about what sites you might identify. If you haven't done that yet, that's okay. We can help you. There's still time. You want to start thinking about your sam.gov and grants.gov account, which we're going to talk more about. And if you've met me before, you've talked to me about sam.gov because it's my personal soapbox. If you are going to do a cleanup grant or a multi-purpose grant, then you want to start thinking, and you don't yet own the property that you intend to clean up, you want to go ahead and start working on that ownership transfer, making sure that you do it appropriately, which we'll also talk about. Generally, the grant guidelines are released in the early fall. Last year, they were released in mid-September. And so we anticipate that will be the general timeline again this year, based on what we're hearing from EPA. Sometimes it can go into October, depending on when there are large changes, but we don't anticipate a large change this year based on what we know in this moment. And so we expect that it'll be an early fall release. Generally speaking, they give it about 60 days of an application period, like most federal grants. So they'll be due in late fall. And then if you're on our listserv, you saw the announcements just last week from the previous year. So it takes into the following spring for all of those grants to be reviewed and evaluated and then compared with one another, and for EPA to make the final award decisions. So those come out in May, and then the grants start in the fall of the next year. So the grants that were applied for in fall of 2022 were announced last week, and they'll start work in October of this year. Right. So what can you do now to get set up for success on your proposal for this round? One of the first things you can start to do is put together a team for your brownfield redevelopment. Some folks that this might include would be your property owner, especially if you're only looking at one site. But even if you're looking at a community-wide assessment where you'll have multiple sites, you don't have to have a formal agreement from a property owner at this stage for an assessment grant, but it's nice to go ahead and get started and start to build those relationships, because if the property owner is not interested in engaging, then it's not going to go anywhere, right? So it never hurts to start that conversation as early as possible. A developer, if there are some folks who are interested in developing a site, whether that's a nonprofit or public developer or a private entity, there may be some investors or potential buyer, folks who might want to locate on the site, so tenants, other local stakeholders like your public entities, your city and county government, community groups, nonprofits, just other general community stakeholders. And of course, the DEP and EPA can be helpful along the way, as well as the Brownfields Assistance Centers. We're happy to help on any of your brownfields projects at any stage. You can start, one thing you can start to think about right now is inventorying your sites. There are brownfields in every community. I always quote George as saying that if man has been there, it is a brownfield. And so I promise you, you have brownfields in your community wherever you are. It's just a matter of how big they are and how many there are. And so figuring out which sites there are and which ones are have redevelopment potential and are a priority for a community is the first step in that process. And you can't really get started until you know what you're dealing with. So we have some support that we can help you start to think about that inventory. You can also continue to update your inventory as part of your activities on an assessment grant, but it never hurts to start thinking about sites, because you are going to have, even in a community-wide assessment, you are going to have to list some of your target sites and the sites that you hope and expect to assess. So it's good to start thinking about that as early as possible and getting as much information about those sites as you can as you're planning. So all appropriate inquiry, if you're going to do a cleanup grant, you have to own the property that you are applying to clean up at the time of your application. And you have to have completed what's called all appropriate inquiry within 180 days or about 6 months of the property transfer. So this helps demonstrate that you, this makes you an eligible entity. You could be eligible in every other way, but not have done your all appropriate inquiry at the property transfer and get disqualified at the threshold stage. So we want to make sure that you're not disqualified for that purpose, and we can help you again with that. There are resources available both to conduct the actual AAI, and also George and I and our teams can help you understand what that process looks like and help you navigate that process as you're transferring a property. So this is done to determine any potential environmental concerns at a property. It might include a phase one. Often and most of the time it does include a phase one, and certain pieces of that phase one which have to be updated within 180 days of the transfer. It is important because it not only makes you eligible for EPA grant funding, but it does give you some liability protection and can help you have a better picture, not a full picture, but a better picture of the assets and liability on the property you're talking about. So if somebody says they want to donate a property to you or sell it to you for $1, that might be great, but don't sign on the dotted line until you call me or George and make sure we've done all the AAI so you have all the resources available that you might need. So say yes, but wait. Is the moral of that story. All right. So in addition to that stuff, sort of thinking about sites and getting ready on your project side, another key piece that can trip you up on getting prepped for applying for a grant are these government systems that you have to be in, and that can be a little wonky to navigate and can take a little bit of time. So you want to start those as early as possible. So where do you even begin? In order to apply for an EPA grant and any federal grant, you have to complete a registration with sam.gov. You also have to have an account at grants.gov. And again, you have to do that AAI if you're doing a cleanup or a multi-purpose grant. We're going to talk a little bit about that. SAM stands for System for Award Management. This is the system that the government uses to have registration for anyone who's doing any kind of business with the government. It is something that has to be, you have to do it, you have to renew it. At sam.gov, you can do that registration process, you can check the status of your registration, you can update and renew, and you can look at others. This slide says it can take at least 2 weeks or more to complete. That's what they say. Assume it will take at least a month, if not much longer. There is a significant backlog. It's not an automatic system. So you fill out a form, and then there are a lot of things that have to be verified. There are forms you have to upload, documents you have to upload. And so it is not, you cannot do it at the end of the deadline. So you definitely want to get it taken care of. If you have applied for federal funding in the past, you may already have a sam.gov account and all the appropriate numbers, but don't assume that just because you have a currently active federal grant that it's not, it does have to be renewed. So it does expire. And this is something that the Brownfield Centers can help you with. Once you have a sam.gov account and registration, you can connect with grants.gov. This is the centralized location, the clearinghouse that the federal government uses for almost all of their federal funding opportunities, and EPA uses it for all. You also need to register with grants.gov in advance. There's not as much of a verification process, but you do have to have certain things connected appropriately to your sam.gov so that whoever is doing the application has the appropriate authorization to submit that grant on behalf of your organization. All EPA grants have to be submitted through this site. There are some very, very strict circumstances where they will allow you to not submit through grants.gov, and they are almost never allowed. So assume that you're going to grants.gov and that you need to make sure that that's all in place, and assume that it will not work the way you want it to work every time. So give yourself a little buffer room, like any online system, right? Everything crashes at the worst possible moment. So make sure you have some time built in. And again, you do have to have an account for your organization to be considered for funding. It's possible to have an account on grants.gov that just allows you to look at grants. And so if you have that, that does not necessarily mean that you are all set up to apply for grants. So you want to make sure that you are set up with the right kind of account and that you have the right permissions for your entity or your organization in order to apply. And again, you want to start that as early as possible so you don't get, we don't want anybody to get a really great grant put together and put in all the hard work and then get stuck at the finish line for one of these systems. And that has happened, and it's just heartbreaking. And we know there's really great projects out there, and we want them to compete with everyone. All right. And now I think I'm tossing it to Erin, who's going to take us through to the end and talk a little bit more about next steps.
Absolutely. Thanks, Carrie. I'm Erin Britton. I'm the Brownfields Program Manager at the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. And good morning, everybody. I'm so glad we have such a good turnout today. So yeah, we've talked a little bit about this. I think George and Carrie hit on this, but guidelines are typically released in September. You have at least 60 days to get your application in. Typically the deadline is November, early December every year. And then it's just, you wait for about 6 months and cross your fingers, and hopefully you get a really good announcement in May. We just did last week, actually, the West Virginia, well, everyone in the country who was awarded, that was announced last week. And then implementation for the grant begins about October 1st every year. So this is basically, you know, a year-long process from start to finish. But it's definitely better to get started early because those 60 days fly by. Trust me, it goes by so quickly that it's so much better to get started now. All right, next. So the DEP and the Brownfields Assistance Centers are here to help, and we usually do a grant writing workshop every summer, and we used to do all of these in person, and of course during the pandemic we went to virtual, and this year we're excited to do a combined virtual and in person, and we really want to do as much help early as we can. So we will be doing it in person in July, which will come up in a slide here in a couple of minutes. But specifically what we can help with, we can help you identify your target areas for assessment grants. You always need to have at least one, depending on which grant you're applying for. And it's really key to have very involved community stakeholders, and we can help you with that as well. The budget table is always a little tricky to navigate, and we can help you with that and provide examples from past applications. We can provide templates of previous applications as well for both assessment and cleanup grants. And for cleanup grants, it's so very important. And I know George and Carrie has touched on this as well. For cleanup grant applications, you must own the site, and you must have that AAI in place before transferring title. So that is key. Again, contact us if you have any questions about that, or if you're thinking about a cleanup grant application, we can definitely help with that. Again, community stakeholders and that public meeting and the public notice is key for the cleanup grant application. And then the ABCA that George touched on as well, we can help you with that and provide examples from previous ABCAs that we have, and help identify matching funds, that 20% for cleanup grant applications, the typical 20% of the regular appropriated funding. So next. All right, so like I said, there's homework to do. Even though our kids are getting out of school now, we get homework, of course, but no worries, no you know, butterflies in your stomach or anything like that. We won't be grading your homework, but like I said, those 60 days just fly by. So it's better to get started now, 6 months before it's even due, just to start, you know, writing out your target areas and making sure you're, you know, checking off all those requirements in the guidelines. So definitely eligibility, as we said. Make sure you own the property if you have, if you're going to be applying for a cleanup grant. Have your project purpose and project area defined very specifically with a lot of details and background. And then your community partners, make sure you know exactly, you know, who you're going to put in your application and exactly what they're going to do to help you with your grant. And then your brownfield site inventory, just start, driving down the road and start writing down, okay, this site has been abandoned for a few years. We'll write it down, put it on your list, and make sure you have a good address, and start looking up the site history. And then, okay, does it need a phase 1? Do you think it might need a phase 2 environmental site assessment or an asbestos inspection, things like that? Just start jotting this down now and start your inventory. For cleanup grants, make sure your environmental assessment, those phase 1s and 2s are complete, and make sure if you think you might need a little bit more assessment, feel free to reach out to me, and we can certainly do that for you if there's any gaps in your assessments that you've done so far. Again, for cleanup grants, make sure you have that AAI piece done. Again, if you need a phase 1 ESA, feel free to contact me and we could definitely fund that for you. As Carrie mentioned, make sure you are good to go with SAM.gov and grants.gov, and please start that process early. I think every year there's always one application that doesn't get submitted because of either SAM.gov or grants.gov issues. And then your redevelopment plans, that the APCAs are key. Make sure you have that in place, and even if you have sites for your assessment grant, what those needs are, and if you have reuse planning ideas for those, put that on your inventory as well. And if you need help, we cannot emphasize this enough, please reach out to Carrie, George, Mark, or me anytime, and we will start helping you as soon as possible. Next. And like I said earlier, we have an in-person workshop coming up that I'm super excited about. It's in Morgantown on July 20th. You can register today. And if you can't make it up to Morgantown, if you're in the southern part of the state, feel free to contact George or Mark, and they are on the road all the time and can help you. Just let them know. And they will meet you somewhere. They can look at your brownfield site and start helping you put together your grant application. And as always, we have one of the best brownfields conferences in the country. Our next conference will be at Ogilvy Resort in Wheeling, September 12th through the 14th. And again, looking forward to that. It's always a great time and a great event in September every year. And then this year, we also have a national conference in Detroit. It's in August, and registration is out now, and you can feel free to register today if you would like. And it's a wealth of knowledge. I 100% encourage everyone to go and attend and learn more than you ever thought you would learn about brownfields. Next. So again, please contact any of us anytime. We can get started in July. If you would like to come to Morgantown, we'd love to see you. Our email addresses are there below. And thank you for coming. And I'll turn it back over to Becca. But if you have any questions, feel free to put that in the chat.
Thank you to all our speakers, and thanks, Becca, for launching that poll. If you could all take this quick poll, this just helps us track that we're on the right track with all of our things. We do have a helpful clarification from Joe Nowak, who is our state lead from EPA for West Virginia, and he clarifies for us that George mentioned that they had made some changes to the coalition assessment grants in the last round, and we expect that those are going to stick around for a little bit, and so that change means that the lead organization or lead applicant in a coalition assessment grant can only be certain entities. And you can see that he's listed all of those there. But basically state, county governments, regional councils, or a group of governments that are authorized to function as a legal entity. Also tribes, although we don't have any federally recognized tribes in West Virginia. So thanks, Joe. That's a great clarification. And that's one of the sort of nuances that the centers and DEP can help navigate as you get into thinking about a coalition grant, for sure. So thanks for that. So yeah, feel free. We have a small enough crew. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I think we have a small enough crew that if you want to put your question in the chat, you can do that, and Becca and I will pay attention to that. And then, or you can raise your hand if you'd rather ask your question aloud. We can do that as well.
while they're doing that, Carrie, I'll just add, going to have the in-person workshop in July. And then I guess we'll call it the Mark and George Road Show. It might be Mark and occasionally George, we'll see. But if you happen to be in a northern spot and you can't make it to the July one, hey, get a hold of us. We'll get somebody from Carrie's group, or we'll figure out a way to meet with you and talk with you. We can do it by Zoom or meet in person. We'd rather meet in person if at all possible, if we can. But you know, we're here to help you. And our rates are still $0 an hour, so it's a pretty decent investment, I think.
That's right. And that training in Morgantown is free. You do need to register so that because we will feed you lunch. So we need to know how many lunches to buy, but it is completely free and it'll be scheduled. I think it's scheduled from 10 to 3. So that allows you to do it in one day if you want from most places, or to stay over if you need to. And we'll also have some grant writing trainings at the Brownfields conference in September on the 12th as well. It won't be a full workshop. It won't look exactly like the July workshop, but there will be additional information and training about that. And we'll share that as the registration opens for the state conference in the next month or so.
And I'll also add, it's looking at the participant list, see a lot of familiar names and also see some new ones there too. Great that we've got some new folks that are joining us. Appreciate you joining with us today, and we're here to help you. So so with that, Carrie, take it away.
Let's see. I have a question. Can a property owner use a brownfield grant to remove abandoned tanks from their property? They are not the responsible party for the tank. Possibly is the short answer. So with the hypothetical, if it was an eligible owner, meaning that they took the property, that they did all appropriate inquiry, that could be an eligible expense, but there would be, we would need more specifics to answer completely, but it is possible that a cleanup grant could remove abandoned tanks from a property.
I would add that, that takes a lot more work there to determine, looking at responsible parties and past historical usage, et cetera. But with the folks at DEP and us, we can figure that out. We just would have to get a lot of specifics on that, but it could be eligible. It just depends on site specific conditions.
Yeah, and we'd be happy to talk with you offline about this if you want to follow up with either of us. We kind of ignore, we didn't say this before, we kind of ignore the north and south border and help where we can help, right, George?
I tell people that Carrie and I are really poor in geography, and we don't go by the map at all. Happy to go where needed.
That's right. Divide and conquer. All right. Any other questions? I don't see anything else coming in just yet. We did get several questions as we were talking, and Becca answered in the chat, but in case you're not following the chat, we did record today, and we will be sharing the slides and the recording once Becca can get them processed and uploaded to the appropriate place. So if you registered, we have your email address, and she will send that out to you in the next few days. It does require, it's not an automatic, so it was not immediate, but she's fast, that one. All right, any other questions?
I'll add just one more comment. If you've never attended our state Brownfield conference, it's a great opportunity to come and just learn from other people. You can hear about what other communities are doing and what may or may what has worked and what hasn't worked, quite frankly. But we also have consulting firms that are there that do a lot of the assessment work. We've got developers that come. We've got various city and different officials that come. So there's a wide variety of sessions that I'm sure will pique your interest. So if you haven't came to one before, we'd encourage you to. We think it'll be well worth your while. And if you do get the chance to go to the national conference, as Aaron said, you can go and learn ideas from other regions, other parts of the country, see what other folks are doing. And I call it stealing ideas, but I guess officially it's taking their ideas and then molding them to fit your needs. So if you could get that opportunity, we'd encourage you to do that at least once. It'd be well worth your while.
Definitely. And I would say that it's also there are really great people to learn from, and they're all of the folks at the West Virginia DEP and at EPA Region 3. We have the best staff at state and regional offices. And so they are all, DEP has a great showing at both of those conferences. I believe that there's going to be quite a few reps from Region 3 at both the West Virginia conference and in Detroit. So it's a good time to get some face time with them as well. And we do partner for the state conference with the Main Street, West Virginia Main Street and On Track. So there's also a lot of opportunities to hear about some smaller scale projects and downtown projects. It's just a good synergy and a good chance. And we've got some really fun stuff planned this year. So it's going to be a great conference and some great mobile workshops that are going to highlight some successful EPA grantees. So it's a good chance to see the impact of some of the things that you've heard about. And we mentioned before that the announcements came through last week, but West Virginia received almost $6 million in EPA Brownfields funding this time around. We had a really great success rate because we had really quality projects. And we were excited to have worked on a lot of those. And so this is the first step for how you can get a piece of that pie the next time around. All right. Well, I am happy to hang around for a few minutes if anybody wants to stick around and ask questions, but otherwise I don't see anything for the full group. Thanks again to our speakers, and thanks to you for giving us an hour of your time this morning. And I hope to see you sometime over the summer and in September.
Thanks, Carrie.